watched Twilight 2008, I wasn't really prepared for the strange, melancholic pull it would have over me, that fragile mix of innocence and danger, where high school hallways blur into forests dripping with rain, and a girl's quiet longing becomes a heartbeat of an entire supernatural myth. My dear literature-loving friends, this isn't just another teenage fantasy about love at first sight. It's a delicate exploration of obsession and restraint, of youth brushing against eternity. The first time Bella Swan steps into the gray-skied town of Forks, she feels like someone out of her own world, and perhaps that's why the story feels so personal. Because who among us hasn't felt like we were walking through our own fog, hoping someone might finally see us clearly? That's where Edward Cullen enters, silent, unreadable, almost sculpted from the mist itself. And the film begins weaving its hypnotic rhythm, one that still lingers like the aftertaste of first heartbreak. It's impossible to talk about this story without acknowledging its peculiar stillness, a kind of quiet ache that runs beneath every frame. The Pacific Northwest isn't just a setting here. It's an emotional condition. Every drizzle, every cloud, every muted color feels like the visual echo of Bella's inner state. Alienated yet romantic, hesitant yet fiercely alive. You can almost smell the wet bark and cold air, the subtle scent of rain on moss as she walks towards something unknown. That alluring danger called Edward. Their connection feels faded, but not in the traditional Hollywood sense. It's uncomfortable, even awkward, almost painful to watch at times. Two souls drawn together, terrified of what that union could unleash. The restraint between them is what gives the movie its pulse. While most romances rush toward touch, Twilight holds back, hovering on the edge of contact. That distance is electric. It's poetry written in glances and unfinished sentences. As I revisit it now, I find myself strangely protective of its sincerity. For all its cultural mockery over the years, the film dares to take teenage emotion seriously. Bella's quiet rebellion isn't loud or witty. It's inward, existential. She's a girl negotiating meaning in a world that doesn't seem to fit her. And when she meets Edward, it's as if she's found a mirror to her strangeness. Someone equally displaced, equally yearning. Their love isn't healthy in any conventional sense, but perhaps that's the point. True adolescence never is. It's messy, consuming, slightly self-destructive, and full of mythic self-importance. The film understands that, and instead of mocking it, it lets the melodrama breathe. The creaking floorboards of Forks High, the cafeteria stairs, the flicker of fluorescent lights, all these details build a world that feels tactile and lived in, even as vampires lurk behind it. There's a quiet beauty in how the camera lingers, how it allows emotion to unfold without irony. The cinematography doesn't just capture rain, it worships it. The colors are pale, almost drained, mirroring the way Edward's life has been leached of warmth until Bella arrives. That palette, silvers, muted greens, cloudy whites, becomes a visual metaphor of their relationship. It's love trapped between life and death, color and monochrome. I think about that often, how the film's entire look is like the sensation of being suspended between choices. For Bella, every heartbeat is a negotiation between fear and surrender. For Edward, every second with her is temptation wrapped in tenderness. The tension is not about whether they'll kiss, but whether he can resist killing her. That's the strange genius of it. Romance built not on passion fulfilled, but passion withheld. The first time Edward saves Bella from a van in the school parking lot, the film's tone shifts. Suddenly, reality trembles. That single act of supernatural speed shatters the human world she's known. It's a small moment, yet it feels mythic. From then on, the mundane, classrooms, rainy streets, old pickup trucks begins to coexist with a mortal hunger. This collision of ordinary and extraordinary is what keeps Twilight strangely captivating. It's a fairy tale told through the vocabulary of high school. Lockers instead of castles, cafeteria gossip instead of court intrigue. And somehow that works. Because love, when we first experience it, is mythic to us, even when it's wrapped in teenage awkwardness. But what really makes the story resonate, even now, is how it treats longing as a kind of philosophy. The film never rushes to prove its love story. It lingers in uncertainty. The dialogue is hesitant, the pacing slow, and the silence is heavy with unsaid desire. You can almost feel the weight of every pause between Bella and Edward, as if the movie itself is afraid to breathe too loudly. That's what gives it its haunting quality. When Edward finally confesses what he is, the forest around him becomes a cathedral of mist and secrets. That confession isn't just about being a vampire. It's about the fear of what one truly is and the hope that someone might still love them despite it. Isn't that the universal human wish? That someone might see our monstrosity and not turn away? In the end, what makes Twilight endure isn't its supernatural lore or even its romance. It's that it captures an emotion we've all felt but rarely admit to, the terror and thrill of surrendering control. Watching Bella step into Edward's world feels like witnessing the moment someone decides to give up the safety of detachment for the danger of feeling too much. The film, for all its imperfections, treats that leap with reverence. It invites us to remember our own first loves, those that felt eternal even when they weren't, those that scared us with their intensity, those that left us wondering who we became because of them. That's what keeps me returning to Forks. Not the vampires, but the ache of recognition. So here we are, my friends, standing again in that rain-soaked forest, between life and legend, watching a girl and a vampire redefine what it means to love beyond reason. The story begins not with fangs or fear, but with a heartbeat slowed to a whisper, a fragile rhythm that will carry us through the rest of this strange, glittering tale. The story truly begins to unfurl once Bella settles into her new life in Forks, that quiet, moss-drenched town where time feels slower and even sunlight seems hesitant. The first half of the film moves like a dream filtered through overcast skies, gentle, hesitant, but always pulsing with something unsaid. We see her trying to adjust to a rhythm that doesn't belong to her, the small-town gossip, the friendly classmates try and pull her in, the awkward flirtation she neither rejects nor encourages. Yet there's a deep solitude in her presence, an unspoken longing to be somewhere else, or perhaps to belong somewhere that doesn't yet exist. When she first notices Edward cross the cafeteria, surrounded by his pale, otherworldly siblings, it's not attraction in the ordinary sense. It's recognition, that haunting awareness that this person's existence somehow disturbs the axis of your own. From that moment, the tone of the movie changes. The slow, everyday world of high school becomes charged with quiet tension. The way Edward looks at her, first with apparent disgust, then with almost painful fascination, transforms the mundane into something cosmic. Every biology class becomes a test of endurance. Every accidental brush of hands feels monumental. There's something unnerving about their connection in those early scenes. It's not playful or flirtatious. It's a study in control and surrender. When Bella drops her pen or Edward stiffens at her scent, it feels like the entire room is holding its breath. The director leans into this tension by stretching time, long silences, slow pans, minimal dialogue, as if love itself is too dangerous to speak aloud. The first act, in many ways, is a study in observation. Bella watches Edward, Edward watches Bella, and we watch them both try and make sense of what they're feeling. When Edward disappears for days after their first encounter, it feels like emotional whiplash. The confusion of someone suddenly being drawn into a gravity they don't understand, only to find it abruptly gone. Yet that absence builds anticipation, the kind of aching curiosity that defines young love. When he returns, his tone softer, his defenses slightly lowered. The film allows a fragile tenderness to creep in. It's that cafeteria scene where he warns her to stay away, his voice trembling between menace and care, that captures the essence of their relationship. Love is both sanctuary and threat. Then comes a van accident, the film's first true rupture between the ordinary and the supernatural. The moment is brief, but the impact enormous. 1 second Bella's chatting with friends. The next, she's pinned in the path of a speeding vehicle. And then, impossibly, Edward is there, faster than sight, stronger than reason, his hand leaving a dent in the metal as he saves her life. It's a jarring revelation, the first crack in his carefully constructed facade of humanity. For Bella, that act changes everything. You can almost see her mind ignite with disbelief and wonder. The rest of the world fades. Edward's secret becomes the gravitational center of her reality. What follows is a dance of curiosity and concealment. Bella's determination to uncover the truth mirrors Edward's struggle to maintain it. Their scenes together oscillate between warmth and unease. In the forest, at lunch, on the road, every conversation teeters on the edge of revelation. There's a beautiful tension in how the camera treats Edward, sometimes angelic in the light, sometimes monstrous in shadow. That duality embodies the film's central idea, that love can be both salvation and destruction. When Bella confronts him after piecing together the clues, the cold skin, the unnatural strength, the aversion to sunlight, it feels less like fear and more like surrender. Her words, steady yet trembling, carry the tone of someone who has already chosen, long before understanding the cost. The forest scene where Edward finally reveals himself, stepping into the sunlight to expose his glittering skin, has become iconic, though often mocked. Yet beneath the memes lies something deeply tragic. He says, "This is the skin of a killer," and the camera lingers on his luminous, fractured beauty. It's not a boast, it's a confession, a plea to be understood, even rejected. But Bella doesn't flinch. That moment redefines the power dynamic. She, the fragile human, becomes a fearless one. He, the immortal predator, becomes the one afraid. It's a reversal of mythology, love turning the monster into something vulnerable. As the first half progresses, their bond deepens through stolen conversations, awkward laughter, and shared silences. Edward takes her to the forest, runs with her through the treetops, and shows her the world as he sees it. For a brief moment, it feels like freedom. Yet even in these romantic interludes, there's a constant undercurrent of danger. He warns her again and again, "You don't know how much I thirst for your blood." And still, she stays. It's as if Bella isn't just falling for him, but for the very idea of danger, for the possibility that love could be something that consumes, not comforts. The first half of the film closes on a note of uneasy tranquility. Bella has learned the secret, and rather than recoil, she accepts it. Edward, against every instinct, begins to trust her presence in his world. There's a quiet afternoon scene, them lying together in her room, sunlight filtering weakly through the blinds, that feels almost like a truce between life and death. It's tender but tragic, because we can sense it won't last. The beauty of this early stretch lies in its restraint. Nothing overtly dramatic happens beyond these confessions, yet everything inside them feels seismic. Looking back on this portion of the story, I'm struck by how much of it depends on silence, on what is not said. It's a romance that doesn't explode outward but implodes inward, feeding on its own intensity. Bella isn't trying to change Edward. She's simply trying to exist in the same breath as him. And that desire to coexist with something impossible is what propels the film's entire emotional momentum. By the midpoint, we know this love is both doomed and inevitable. And that's the perfect paradox that keeps us watching, the quiet certainty that something beautiful must eventually break. The second half begins with the illusion of calm, but it's the kind of calm that trembles before a storm. Bella and Edward have crossed an invisible line between fascination and commitment. Now they exist in that fragile space where every moment feels borrowed. The film's atmosphere subtly shifts. Colors deepen. Shadows linger longer, and the camera begins to frame them not as two curious strangers, but as lovers standing on a precipice. There's warmth in their closeness, yes, but also the constant hum of threat. The awareness that what binds them could also destroy them. As Bella immerses herself more fully into Edward's world, she becomes entangled not just in his affection, but in his family's delicate balance with the human world. The Cullen, so self-controlled and principled, exists like ghosts pretending at civility, and Bella's presence both charms and unsettles them. The dinner scene at the Cullen house captures this beautifully. It's awkward, almost comic, yet charged with layers of meaning. Bella, nervous and sincere, tries to navigate this polite gathering of vampires who prepared food they can't eat. There's tenderness in their effort. A family of immortals trying to appear human for the girl who has made their brother feel alive again. Yet beneath the smiles lies tension, an unspoken fear that this love could unravel their centuries of restraint. Carlyle's gentle wisdom, Esme's kindness, Rosalie's visible disapproval. Each reaction reflects a fragment of Edward's fractured self. Bella is not simply meeting his family. She's stepping into the history that made him both haunted and holy. Their love scenes, restrained yet electric, push against the boundaries of control. When Edward sneaks into Bella's room, lying beside her as she sleeps, it should feel invasive, but instead feels achingly tender, the longing of someone who's been starved of closeness for too long. Their intimacy exists almost entirely in gestures and silences, the brush of a hand, the quiet exchange of breath. The film's use of music here, Carter Burwell's delicate piano motif, weaves a melancholy thread through these moments, underscoring the idea that love in this world is a kind of mourning in advance. The turning point comes when their fragile bubble is shattered by the arrival of the nomadic vampires, James, Victoria, and Laurent, whose hunger and recklessness threaten everything. The meadow scene, with its soft light and suspended serenity, is interrupted by the primal tension of predators entering the frame. The tone flips instantly from romance to survival. James, played with unnerving focus, locks onto Bella not out of need but out of obsession. The thrill of the chase. His declaration that he wants to hunt her isn't just an act of violence. It's symbolic of the darker forces always encircling forbidden love. For the first time, Edward's protective instincts overtake his restraint, and the story sheds its quiet tone for something urgent and raw. The Cullens rally around Bella, and the narrative shifts from internal struggle to external conflict. The family's cooperation, the way they move with precision, their unspoken coordination, reveals what it truly means for Edward to have lived among them. A constant negotiation between instinct and morality. When they plan Bella's escape, the tension is almost unbearable because beneath the action lies an emotional truth. Edward has finally found something he can lose. The way he touches her face before they separate, whispering that it's the safest way, feels more devastating than any grand declaration. You sense that he doesn't fully believe in safety anymore. He's just pretending hope for her sake. The chase sequence, while brief, injects the film with a new kind of energy, kinetic and dangerous. Bella, guided by Alice and Jasper, becomes the hunted, her human vulnerability thrown into harsh relief against a vampire's supernatural grace. The contrast reminds us of what the story has always been about, the fragility of human life in the face of timeless beings. Her flight to Phoenix isn't just about escaping James. It's a symbolic return to the mortal world she once wanted to leave behind. Yet, as is often the case in love stories with mythic undertones, you can't outrun the forces you've invited in. The confrontation in the ballet studio is the film's emotional and visual climax, a place of mirrors and echoes where love is reflected through violence. The choreography of that scene, the shattered glass, the distorted reflections, the flickering light, transforms a simple fight into something operatic. James toys with Bella, filming her pain to torment Edward. It's a perverse inversion of their love story. Where Edward has fought to preserve her life, James seeks to immortalize her suffering. When Edward arrives, his fury feels volcanic. He's no longer the restrained, self-denying figure from the classroom or the meadow. He's a creature undone by love. The brutality of his fight, the anguish when he sees Bella bleeding, expose the other side of desire, the part that can't coexist with reason. The bite sequence is perhaps the film's most haunting moment. As Bella lies dying, venom spreading through her veins, Edward faces the ultimate paradox. To save her, he must come closer to destroying her. Carlyle's command, "You have to stop," hangs in the air as Edward fights his own nature, drinking just enough of her blood to remove the poison without succumbing to hunger. That moment, silent except for the rising score, encapsulates the entire film's emotional thesis. Love as restraint, love as self-annihilation. His trembling face as he pulls away, red-eyed and broken, tells us everything about what it costs to love someone you can't have. The hospital scene that follows offers a fragile reprieve. Bella wakes, pale but alive, surrounded by the clinical sterility of human life. Her mother's chatter feels alien now, a reminder of the normality she's outgrown. When Edward insists that she should go to Jacksonville, far away from danger, it's not a plea born of indifference but of despair. He wants her safe, but knows she won't be whole without him. Their dialogue carries that quiet tragedy of people who understand that love doesn't always align with logic. And yet, in the prom scene that follows, the film gives us a momentary illusion of peace. That dance beneath the twinkling lights, her casted leg resting on a shoe, their faces inches apart, feels like a heartbeat suspended in time. The setting, the music, the glimmer of fairy lights all suggest a happy ending, but the undercurrent tells another story. When Bella asks him to turn her into a vampire, and he refuses, we understand that the cycle of longing and denial will continue. The final shot of Victoria watching him from a distance ensures that this love story is far from complete. Reflecting on this half, I realize how perfectly it balances its romantic core with the creeping inevitability of loss. The film's pace, once languid, accelerates toward heartbreak, yet never loses its meditative tone. It's less about what happens and about how it feels, the texture of a love that burns cold and bright at once. By the end, we're left not with closure, but with a haunting question. Can a love born of danger ever truly survive peace? And perhaps that's the secret charm of this film. It never resolved that tension. It simply invites us to live inside it. There's something unsettling yet magnetic about the way the world of Twilight begins to fold into itself once Bella realizes she's not just drawn to Edward, but tethered to him by something older than reason. As the plot thickens through the middle act, the film starts layering tension in a way that oscillates between romantic yearning and quiet dread. Edward's confession of what he truly is feels less like a reveal and more like an initiation into another dimension of reality, one that makes the ordinary world of Forks seem like a fragile facade. When he admits to being a vampire, the entire tone of the story bends. It's not about boy meets girl anymore. It's about human meets myth, about mortal curiosity meeting the permanence of an immortal conscience. What lingers most is not the fear of danger, but the electricity of discovery, that thrilling awareness of being pulled toward the forbidden. From here on, every encounter between them carries a hypnotic mix of restraint and hunger. Their conversations become charged with double meanings. Every brush of a hand feels like it could tip into violence or ecstasy. The meadow scene, the moment when Edward steps into the sunlight and his skin glimmers like diamonds, works almost as a surreal visual metaphor rather than a literal display of vampiric traits. It's the moment the story abandons realism completely and embraces mythic romance. The light doesn't just reflect off his skin. It reflects the idea that love, when truly absolute, becomes something divine, dangerous, and incomprehensible. Bella's awe in that moment feels like the awe of humanity facing something it was never meant to understand. And Edward's hesitation to let her see him that way deepens his tragedy. He doesn't sparkle for vanity. He sparkles as someone cursed with beauty he never wanted. This act also begins to establish the moral paradox of their relationship. Edward insists that his thirst for Bella's blood makes her unsafe. Yet that same danger is what binds them. The scenes in the forest, in his car, and especially during their confrontation about his nature, are written and shot with careful contrast. Her warmth against his cold attachment, her heartbeat against his silence, her fleeting mortality against his unending stillness. What emerges is a delicate equilibrium between predator and lover, and that duality is what gives Twilight its unmistakable pulse. The movie thrives not on action, but on the anticipation of action, the quiet moments where you sense everything could collapse if either of them loses control. The introduction of the Cullen family expands this tension further. Their home, bathed in pale light and modern symmetry, becomes a mirror of the paradox Edward lives in, a family of monsters desperately trying to emulate the grace of humanity. Carlisle, Esme, Alice, Jasper, and Emmett each add dimension to this strange domestic sanctuary, and the dinner scene where Bella awkwardly joins him feels like an allegory of love crossing lines of nature and nurture. The Cullens' attempt at normalcy, cooking food they can't eat, exchanging polite smiles that don't reach their eyes, turns a human act of dining into a theater of yearning. Bella fits in by not fitting in. Her humanity becomes the rarest quality in a room of immortals. As the film shifts gears with the arrival of the nomadic vampires, James, Victoria, and Laurent, the romance finds its first external threat. James's predatory interest in Bella reframes Edward's self-control as something extraordinary, even heroic. Suddenly, Edward's restraint is not a metaphor. It's a survival mechanism. The film pivots from gothic romance to predator-prey thriller, but without losing its undercurrent of intimacy. What's fascinating is how this tension amplifies their emotional connection. The more danger encroaches, the more their love feels sanctified by risk. Each scene, whether it's a baseball game under thunder or the chase through the woods, carries that dreamlike tone that never lets you forget the story is, at its core, about a girl who steps into a world that was never meant for her and finds belonging there anyway. By the end of this act, Twilight has fully transformed from a story of discovery into one of devotion. Bella's choice to stay, despite knowing the truth, isn't romantic idealism. It's rebellion against mortality itself. She's not in love with a vampire. She's in love with the defiance of limits. And Edward, for all his supernatural strength, becomes the weaker one emotionally because he fears losing control while she's willing to lose everything. That inversion of power is what gives the second half of the film its emotional gravity. It's not about whether they can be together. It's about how much of themselves they can surrender without losing what makes them human. If the first act was about curiosity and awakening, and the second act about revelation and tension, then this point in the story becomes a threshold between passion and peril. Every look between them seems to carry a question neither can answer. Is love worth dying for, or worth living forever for? That's the haunting note the film sustains as it drifts towards final chapters, where the quiet storm of emotion finally explodes into action, and the love story becomes a test of endurance against the very laws of nature. The final act of Twilight begins like a fever dream. The world that had seemed mystical and romantic suddenly sharpens into danger, and everything that once felt ethereal now has consequence. When James sets his sights on Bella, the tone of the film pivots from tender vulnerability to raw survival. But what's remarkable is how seamlessly that shift feels like an extension of the romance rather than a departure from it. Edward's love, once poetic and restrained, is now pushed to its most primal form. He must fight to protect the very life he has spent the entire film trying not to endanger. It's as if the entire story has been leading to this paradox. The predator forced to become the savior of the prey he adores. The chase that follows, from Forks to Phoenix, carries an almost mythic symbolism. The Cullens, bound by an unspoken code of loyalty, come together not as monsters but as guardians. Alice's eerie visions, Rosalie's contained resentment, and Carlyle's quiet leadership make these sequences feel like an orchestration of conflicting instincts, each vampire holding back their nature for a higher form of love. Meanwhile, Bella, isolated and terrified, becomes a fragile center of this storm. When she walks in the ballet studio after receiving a fake call about her mother, the scene feels stripped of fantasy. It's pure dread. The shimmering light of earlier scenes is replaced by the sterile reflections of mirrors, symbolizing illusion, deception, and the disorientation of being human in a supernatural world. James's attack is choreographed with a cold brutality that stands in direct opposition to Edward's controlled passion. Where Edward embodies restraint, James embodies indulgence. He doesn't just hunt Bella. He toys with her, relishing the chase like a creature that knows it's fulfilling its nature. And yet, when Edward arrives, the violence between them feels almost tragic. Two predators tearing each other apart over the meaning of love. It's gothic romance at its most visceral. The sound design, Edward's growl, the shattering glass, the desperate cries, turns the fight into something intimate and almost mournful. You don't just see Edward fighting for Bella's life. You see him fighting against everything he was born to be. The aftermath of the attack is one of the film's most haunting sequences. Bella's broken body lies in the mirrored studio, her life fading, and Edward faces the ultimate moral dilemma. To save her, he must give in to the very urge he has resisted all along. The image of him sucking the venom from her blood, trembling between devotion and destruction, captures the film's central contradiction better than any line of dialogue ever could. It's not just an act of love. It's an act of surrender, of risking damnation to preserve what little humanity he has left. The romantic metaphor becomes complete. Love, in its purest form, is indistinguishable from hunger. When Bella wakes up in a hospital, surrounded by white light, the tone softens into something almost melancholy. Her mother's presence feels distant, like a reminder of the world she's already begun to leave behind. Edward sits at her bedside, once again the still, pale figure restraint, and yet there's something irrevocably changed in his eyes. The experience has hollowed him, deepened him, and you can sense that their relationship has crossed from innocence into inevitability. His insistence that she stay human is both an act of protection and a form of denial. He can't bear the thought of her becoming like him, even though her heart already belongs to his world. The prom scene that follows is perhaps the most poignant of all. The fairy lights, the gentle music, the idyllic beauty of it all. These are human symbols of celebration, but within them is a quiet ache. When Bella and Edward dance together under the twinkling canopy, it's as if the entire film's emotional spectrum is condensed into that single moment. longing, fear, devotion, and the unbearable awareness of impermanence. Bella's plea to be turned into a vampire isn't youthful impulsiveness. It's a human desire to eternalize love, to defy time itself. Edward's refusal, on the other hand, is love as sacrifice, as the choice to suffer rather than corrupt what is pure. Then comes a camera's slow pan to Victoria, watching them from a distance. It's a brilliant stroke of cinematic foreshadowing, the idea that peace in this world can only ever be temporary. Her smirk, framed by the fading light, reminds us that every act of love leaves a ripple of consequence. The story closes not with resolution, but with an unspoken promise of continuation. We sense that Bella and Edward's love, as intoxicating as it is doomed, has only just begun to challenge the boundaries of life and death. By the time the credits roll, the audience isn't left with closure but with a quiet ache, a yearning for something that transcends reason. The love story doesn't conclude. It lingers unresolved, like a heartbeat echoing through the misty woods of Forks. And that's precisely what makes Twilight endure, not its mythology or its special effects, but its portrayal of love as something both beautiful and perilous, tender and consuming. In its final moments, it reminds us that some connections are too deep to be safe and too dangerous to be denied. Watching Twilight through critical lens is like watching two films overlap. The one the audience remembers, drenched in teenage longing and moody lighting, and the one hidden beneath, quietly negotiating questions of morality, agency, and desire in a world defined by its own restraint. What fascinates critics even years later is how a film dismissed by some as melodrama became an emotional landmark for an entire generation. To understand it critically, you have to peel away the pop culture haze and return to its emotional architecture, the way it constructs love as both a salvation and a slow erosion of self. That duality, that simultaneous intoxication and danger, is what elevates Twilight from a simple supernatural romance to a commentary on the fragility of human identity when confronted with the immortal. At its core, Twilight is a study in abstinence, emotional, physical, and moral. Edward's constant self-denial becomes the axis around which the entire film turns. He resists his instincts not just to protect Bella, but to preserve the illusion of virtue, making him a symbol of suppressed desire in a world that equates love with moral endurance. Critics have often noted that the film's language, its slow pacing, whispered dialogue, and elongated pauses, is a cinematic translation of this repression. Every choice of lighting and camera angle seems to communicate that same hesitation, the pull towards something forbidden, the fear of succumbing, the agony of restraint. It's no coincidence that the Pacific Northwest misty palette mirrors the emotional climate of its characters. Everything is veiled. Everything is almost. From a feminist perspective, Bella's passivity has been both criticized and defended. On one hand, she represents the archetype of the submissive heroine, whose agency appears absorbed into the orbit of her immortal lover. But on the other, she embodies an almost radical vulnerability, the courage to surrender without losing consciousness of what she's surrendering to. That's what makes her character intriguing when viewed through postmodern romantic theory. She isn't naive. She's deliberate. Her choice to love Edward, despite the clear danger, challenges the rationalist assumption that safety and happiness are synonymous. Critics like to say Twilight romanticizes dependence, but perhaps it also romanticizes defiance, the willingness to love with full awareness of its potential to destroy. The film's most divisive critical conversation revolves around its portrayal of power and gender. Edward's control, his watchfulness, his paternalistic tendencies, all have been dissected as metaphors for possessive love. Yet it's also true that Bella's attraction to him exposes a cultural tension between fear and fascination with dominance. She doesn't just want to be protected. She wants to be chosen, desired, and known in ways ordinary human connection cannot offer. That fantasy, though unsettling to some, is an ancient one, the longing to be seen completely and still loved. Twilight dramatizes that yearning not as a feminist statement or a patriarchal fantasy, but as an existential question. Can intimacy survive when one person is built to consume the other? In terms of cinematic structure, Twilight plays with contrast rather than complexity. It doesn't aim for realism. It aims for atmosphere. The narrative is linear, but the emotions are cyclical. Every major event, the car accident, the forest confession, the baseball game, the ballet studio battle, functions less as a plot progression and more as a symbolic pulse. The car crash is fate's first intervention. The confession, revelation, the baseball game, community, the studio fight, sacrifice. Each scene is a parable of love confronting its limits. Catherine Hardwicke directs these moments not with the aggression of an action film, but with the hush of a dream, letting silence carry the weight of the story. Critics from 2008 often miss the deeper aesthetic intention beneath the teenage packaging. What seemed like awkward dialogue was, in hindsight, stylized sincerity, a language of yearning stripped of irony. The film doesn't wink at its audience. It dares to feel without apology. That emotional nakedness is precisely what modern cinema often avoids, and what made Twilight resonate so profoundly with viewers who were tired of love being portrayed as a game. For many, it was the first time they saw romance presented as a moral and spiritual battleground, not just a flirtation. The cultural events surrounding Twilight's release further magnify its significance. The late 2000s were saturated with irony, cynicism, and detachment. Superhero franchises dominated, and sincerity was unfashionable. Into that climate came a story that refused to laugh at its own melodrama. It was this very earnestness that created this divide, adored by fans who saw themselves in Bella's emotional honesty, derided by critics who mistook intensity for superficiality. But history has been kinder to Twilight. Retrospective essays now treat it as a case study in emotional authenticity, a film that, while flawed, captured the psychological texture of adolescence better than many of its peers. And then there's the fandom, a phenomenon that became inseparable from the film's critical identity. The so-called Twihard movement wasn't just about obsession, it was about ownership. Millions of young viewers, especially women, refused to let critics dictate the meaning of their emotional experiences. They reclaimed the film as a language of self-expression. That defiance in itself is a cultural event worth studying. The moment when audiences declare that emotional sincerity, no matter how mocked, was valid art. Looking back now, Twilight feels like a mirror reflecting its audience's evolution. The film's quiet awkwardness, its hesitant romance, and its moral contradictions have aged into something almost poetic. It may never win over those who demand realism or irony, but in its pure commitment to feeling, it achieves something rare. It captures a universal ache of first love, the kind that is both terrifying and transformative. Critically, Twilight remains polarizing, but artistically, it endures as a testament to cinema's most dangerous truth. Sometimes, sincerity outlasts sophistication. Behind the sheen of teenage obsession and gothic romance, the making of Twilight was a story of artistic gamble, technical improvisation, and a director's battle to preserve emotional authenticity inside a studio machine that wasn't entirely sure what it had. Few realize how unlikely it was that this film, an adaptation of a young adult novel from a debut writer, would become a global phenomenon. Catherine Hardwicke, who had already made her mark with a gritty 13, approached this project not as fantasy spectacle, but as indie realism dipped in supernatural hues. She wanted it to feel grounded, like a diary entry that happened to include vampires. That choice defined every production decision, from location to lighting to lens. The film's visual identity owes much to its Pacific Northwest setting. Though the novel was set in Forks, Washington, most of the movie was shot in Oregon, around Portland, St. Helens, and Kalama. The overcast skies weren't just atmospheric, they were logistical perfection. Hardwicke used natural cloud cover as her key lighting tool, avoiding harsh sun that would complicate the vampire's pale illusion. Every misty forest shot was a result of both patience and luck. The crew often had to chase clouds, waiting for that perfectly moody, gray diffusion that became Twilight's signature look. Even Edward's glittering skin, often joked about but iconic in its own right, was achieved through layered makeup and subtle CGI sparkle filters, something the visual effects team spent weeks fine-tuning to avoid cartoonish excess. The famous baseball scene, one of the most beloved moments in the film, was pure chaos behind the camera. The actors performed in freezing weather, drenched in Oregon rain, wearing makeup that had to stay flawless despite mud and sleet. The super speed sequences combined wire work, practical effects, and time-sliced camera rigs. Hardwicke insisted on shooting much of it in camera, rather than relying entirely on CGI, giving the sequence its tactile energy. The crew used massive wind machines and booming rock music on set to help the actors maintain rhythm with the eventual soundtrack, Muse's supermassive black hole. It wasn't just post-production magic. It was an on-set dance between chaos and choreography. Casting Twilight was another quiet miracle. Robert Pattinson nearly didn't audition, convinced he wasn't attractive enough for a Hollywood vampire. Kristen Stewart had already impressed Hardwicke with her raw realism in Into the Wild, and it was her intensity that convinced the director to cast Pattinson. During screen tests, Hardwicke filmed them in her own house on her bed, running through the iconic bedroom scenes to test their chemistry. She later said that what sold her wasn't the kiss but the silence between them, how they seemed to listen to each other with unspoken electricity. That rawness defined the film's tone more than any technical design ever could. Budget constraints were severe. Summit Entertainment was still a small studio at the time, and the entire production cost only about $37 million, modest for a film requiring wire stunts, location shoots, and extensive weather management. Because of this, the crew often improvised. Some forest scenes were lit with mirrors and bounce boards rather than elaborate rigs. Many stunts were shot guerrilla style, without full road closures. Hardwicke's background in production design became her greatest weapon. She treated the film's limited resources as creative prompts. The Cullen House, for instance, wasn't built from scratch but discovered. A real architect's home in Portland. Its sleek glass walls perfectly reflecting the vampire's dichotomy of transparency and secrecy. Even the soundtrack has its own legend. Hardwicke personally reached out to indie bands to create an audio world that felt intimate yet otherworldly. Muse, Linkin Park, Iron and Wine, and Paramore all contributed, their tracks stitched into the film like emotional punctuation. Robert Pattinson himself performed 2 songs, Neverthink and Let Me Sign, uncredited, because he was embarrassed by the exposure. Those songs, raw and melancholic, captured Edward's internal struggle far more honestly than any line of dialogue. Fans would later dig through credits and interviews to uncover this hidden contribution, adding another layer to Pattinson's tortured persona both on and off screen. One lesser-known fact is that the meadow scene, the emotional heart of the film, was one of the hardest to capture. It took days of scouting and reshooting, because natural meadows in Oregon were often too muddy, too dark, or too uneven for camera movement. The final version was built partially from 2 different locations, stitched together with clever editing and digital color grading to achieve that luminous, dreamlike glow. Hardwicke later joked that it looked serene but was a mosquito nightmare during filming. The pollen, the humidity, and the constant threat of losing daylight made it one of the crew's most exhausting shoots. Fun trivia abounds too. The blue tint that saturates much of the film wasn't just stylistic. It was a result of color grading tests that accidentally became canon. Hardwicke liked the emotional chill it gave, associating blue tones with isolation and danger. Fans now recognize it instantly as the Twilight filter. Another curiosity. Pattinson injured himself several times during stunt rehearsals, most famously during the forest run sequence when he twisted his ankle on a hidden route but insisted on continuing. He reportedly told Hardwicke, Edward wouldn't limp and finish the take. Stewart, on the other hand, was famous for never using stand-ins unless required by insurance. Her authenticity was literal. She wanted to feel Bella's disorientation. Production also faced skepticism from the studio itself. Summit executives weren't sure a female-directed, female-led fantasy would generate returns comparable to male-driven blockbusters. Hardwicke fought to keep key emotional beats intact, especially the dialogue-heavy scenes that executives wanted to trim. After the film's massive success, she became the most commercially successful female director in history at the time, though she was controversially replaced for the sequel. She has since spoken about how the experience was both exhilarating and disheartening, a triumph that proved female-driven narratives could command global audiences, but also a reminder how quickly Hollywood sidelines its pioneers. The post-production process ran on adrenaline. Visual effects artists had mere weeks to finish the vampire-running sequences, which were composited from wire shots, dolly footage, and CGI background plates. The studio initially hated the glitter effect, calling it too disco, but Hardwicke held her ground. It became one of the film's most infamous and iconic visuals. The editing was also unusually emotional. Music was layered in early, not late, because Hardwicke treated the soundtrack as an emotional script. This gave Twilight its dreamy pacing, its hypnotic rhythm of silence and sound. In retrospect, the production of Twilight feels almost mythic in its own right. It was a film built from intuition rather than formula, guided by a director who believed that sincerity could outshine spectacle. Every behind-the-scenes struggle, every improvised shot, every cold night under the Oregon fog contributed to a cinematic texture that no amount of budget could replicate. That texture, the blend of human vulnerability and supernatural wonder, became the DNA of an entire franchise. And perhaps that's the most fascinating fun fact of all. Twilight didn't just depict a world of immortals. It accidentally created one in pop culture, destined to live forever in the imagination of those who first fell under its strange, glittering spell. The world of Twilight breathes through its setting. It isn't just a backdrop, but a living emotional organism that defines how we experience every look, breath, and silence between the characters. Forks, Washington, a place drenched in perpetual rain and mist, becomes the spiritual core of the story. It's gray, quiet, almost timeless, a world suspended in half-light, where the boundaries between human and supernatural blur. The cinematography amplifies this damp melancholia, using muted blues, silvers, and moss greens to create a visual language of longing. The Pacific Northwest's relentless, overcast skies feel like an externalization of Bella's inner weather, subdued, uncertain, and full of romantic hunger. It's not sunshine that reveals the truth in Twilight, it's shadow. Catherine Hardwicke's choice to ground a supernatural love story in tangible realism was radical. Most vampire films before this leaned on gothic castles, velvet drapery, or chiaroscuro candlelight. Twilight chose the opposite. Fluorescent-lit school corridors, parking lots slick with rain, forests that felt both claustrophobic and infinite. The modern suburban blandness made the mythic elements feel eerily believable. When Edward steps into the cafeteria light, his paleness isn't otherworldly. It's unnerving precisely because it exists in an everyday setting. The camera lingers on these contradictions, the supernatural embedded inside the mundane. The forests of Oregon, standing in for Forks, became a visual metaphor for forbidden intimacy. The towering evergreens, covered in dew, act almost like cathedral pillars, enclosing Bella and Edward in a world of their own. The camera often moves in slow, circular pans during their forest scenes, creating a sense of enclosure and inevitability. Hardwicke relied heavily on handheld movement during dialogue exchanges, especially early in their relationship. You can almost feel the camera hesitate, tremble, and breathe with the characters, a subtle way of visualizing emotional instability. As the romance deepens, the camera steadies, becoming smoother, as though the film itself exhales alongside them. Color plays a silent, yet dominating role. Every human space, Bella's home, the school, the police station, is drenched in warmer, earthy tones, evoking life and imperfection. In contrast, the Cullen household glows with sterile perfection. Cool whites, polished glass, reflective surfaces. This visual duality builds a subconscious tension between mortality and immortality. Even the use of mirrors is intentional. There are few in Bella's world, but many in the Cullens. Reflection becomes a subtle theme, suggesting how Edward sees his humanity mirrored through Bella. When they stand in the sunlight, his diamond-like skin contrasts her soft human fragility, fusing light and mortality into one frame. Lighting design in Twilight is an act of visual poetry. The natural overcast of the Northwest served as the film's diffuser, creating a perpetual soft shadow that lent every face an almost painterly delicacy. Hardwicke and cinematographer Elliot Davis avoided direct sunlight and high contrast. Instead, they chased gray tones, letting the absence of light tell the story. It's a choice that gave the film its instantly recognizable bluish tint, a color temperature deliberately lowered in post-production to enhance coldness and emotional isolation. That look has since become emblematic of late 2000s teen cinema, copied endlessly, but never quite replicated with the same sincerity. One of the most subtle but effective cinematic techniques is Hardwicke's use of perspective. The camera frequently adopts Bella's point of view, literally and emotionally. When she first sees Edward, the shot slightly compresses the background, isolating him in focus as the ambient noise fades. This subjective immersion is crucial. It places a viewer inside Bella's psychological state, where attraction and fear merge into one indistinguishable pulse. During scenes of tension, like the car accident or the forced confession, the camera becomes restless, darting uncertain, matching or confusion. Conversely, Edward's world is often framed with clean symmetry and stillness, suggesting control and timelessness. The interplay of movement and stillness between the mirrors their moral and emotional friction. Sound design complements this aesthetic intimacy. Rain, footsteps, and the hum of fluorescent lights are not just ambient details. They become emotional punctuation. The lack of background noise in key moments forces us to focus on breathing, whispers, and the fragile tremor of voice. It's a minimalist approach that heightens intimacy. Carter Burwell's score, especially Bella's lullaby, flows through this silence like a confession. The piano motifs are simple yet aching, oscillating between major and minor chords as though the melody itself can't decide whether to hope or despair. It's this sonic hesitation that captures the essence of Twilight. Love suspended between life and death, warmth and frost. Production design deserves its own admiration. Every room tells a story. Bella's cluttered, lived-in home radiates humanity, while the Cullen's sleek glass mansion feels like an exhibit in a museum of immortality. Their house, framed with massive windows surrounded by forest, symbolizes exposure and surveillance, as if their polished world is constantly on the brink of shattering. The art and books inside it, the minimalist furniture, even the absence of beds, all deliberate details reinforcing their eternal stillness. The way light enters a house, diffused, soft, and perpetual, mimics the way time enters their lives, slowly, almost reverently. Hardwicke's cinematography never forgets emotion. Consider the meadow scene, arguably one of the most iconic in modern cinema's romantic canon. It's not grand in scale, but monumental in feeling. The camera doesn't cut rapidly or explode in CGI spectacle. It glides slowly, reverently, like a heartbeat that's aware of its own fragility. The natural light bathes them in soft gold, a rare intrusion of warmth in an otherwise cool-toned film. That shift isn't accidental. It's a visual reward, a moment where oppression finally melts into revelation. Every subsequent Twilight sequel tried to imitate this moment, but none captured its purity, because it was filmed not with grandeur but with genuine awe. The film's editing rhythm enhances this sensation of timelessness. Hardwicke uses long dissolves and crossfades between scenes, creating a visual feeling of dreams bleeding into reality. Transitions often feature static establishing shots, trees swaying, rivers flowing, fog creeping, before cutting back to faces. It's as if nature itself watches a love story unfold. The pacing lingers intentionally, prioritizing atmosphere over momentum, making the viewer feel time rather than pass through it. The high school setting, on the other hand, anchors the film in grounded familiarity. Its greenish fluorescent lighting and tiled walls form a jarring counterpoint to the mystical forest. This duality, mundane versus magical, adolescence versus eternity, gives Twilight its haunting resonance. It's why even today, when viewers revisit the film, it doesn't just feel nostalgic. It feels like re-entering a weathered pattern of adolescence itself. Ultimately, the film's setting and cinematic elements merge into a kind of sensory diary. The camera's soft focus, the blue palette, the constant sound of rain, they aren't aesthetic flourishes but emotional architecture. The setting feels both suffocating and liberating, mirroring how first love feels, a world that suddenly expands yet traps you inside its intensity. Hardwicke built Forks not as geography, but as psychology, and that's why, long after the franchise expanded beyond her hands, no sequel ever replicated that strange, tender magic of the first film. The feeling that somewhere under endless rain, love might be both salvation and curse, eternal yet fleeting, as fragile as mist drifting through evergreen silence. Behind every frame of Twilight lies a quiet rebellion, a small, almost accidental revolution in how Hollywood treats emotion, female authorship, and intimacy on screen. What most viewers saw as a dreamy teenage romance was, behind the scenes, a struggle to protect that dream from being flattened into cliché. Catherine Hardwicke, the director, wasn't handed a blockbuster. She was handed a gamble. She fought tooth and nail to make sure this love story kept its strange, hushed sincerity. the sense that we were watching something private unfold in public. Her direction was deeply intuitive, more like a painter chasing light than a technician chasing spectacle. What emerged from that energy was not just a film but a feeling, one that every person on set could sense, even before the first screening. The crew often recalled how Hardwicke ran the set like an emotional laboratory. She was known for pushing actors toward honesty rather than polish. Scenes between Robert Pattinson and Kristen Stewart were often shot multiple times with minimal direction, letting their silences deepen naturally. Instead of rehearsing dialogue endlessly, she'd ask them to share what they thought their characters feared most, and then roll camera while that rawness still lingered. It's why so many moments, a glance in biology class, the trembling in Edward's voice when he says he's dangerous, feel unforced. Hardwicke was creating space for imperfection, something rare in polished studio productions. She'd later describe her directing style on Twilight as controlled chaos with emotional clarity. Kristen Stewart and Robert Pattinson's off-screen dynamic became a kind of myth within the production. From the first screen test in Hardwicke's house, their chemistry was palpable but uneasy, charged with that same mixture of curiosity and discomfort that defines Bella and Edward. Pattinson was famously self-critical, convinced he was doing everything wrong, while Stewart, already grounded and intense at 18, pushed for authenticity in every take. Hardwicke, recognizing that their tension mirrored the film's emotional DNA, didn't try to smooth it out. She let it live on screen. What audiences would later perceive as awkwardness was, in truth, intimacy caught in its rawest form, the inability to hide from one another. There were creative battles, too. The studio wanted a more conventional tone, brighter lighting, faster pacing, more overt action. Hardwicke resisted. She fought to keep the muted color palette, the long silences, and the dreamlike editing rhythm. When early test audiences responded strongly to the emotional intensity, the studio relented, though not without friction. Several producers were convinced the film needed humor to balance the melodrama. Hardwicke disagreed, saying that Twilight was meant to feel like a fever, not a sitcom. It's because of her that the movie retained its melancholic slowness, its rain-drenched heartbeat. One of the most fascinating behind-the-scenes stories concerns the soundtrack. Carter Burwell's Bella's Lullaby wasn't originally written for the film. It evolved from improvisations during piano rehearsals. Hardwicke wanted a theme that felt like Edward was both confessing and apologizing through music. She encouraged Burwell to write something simple enough to sound like it came from Edward himself, not an orchestra. The result, that haunting piano refrain, became the soul of the movie. Even on set, Burwell's draft melody would be played softly between takes to help the actors sink back into the mood. It wasn't just background score, it was emotional scaffolding. Visually, much of the film's identity was formed through improvisation. The famous treetop sequence, where Edward carries Bella to the canopy, was filmed using an ingenious blend of wirework and miniature rigs that the crew nicknamed the Flying Piano because of how clumsy it looked. Pattinson, terrified of heights, pushed through the takes while Stewart whispered lines to keep him steady. The ethereal glide of that scene, what looks effortless on screen, was born from trembling fear and mutual trust. Similarly, the forest confrontation where Edward reveals his true nature was shot over multiple cloudy days, spliced together to preserve continuity of tone. The mist wasn't artificial. It was nature cooperating, as though the weather itself was a production assistant. Many of the supporting cast members later spoke about how unexpectedly intimate the shoot felt. It was a relatively small production by Hollywood standards, with actors spending long hours together in isolated locations. Peter Facinelli Carlisle described it as summer camp for vampires. Ashley Greene Alice remembered Hardwicke insisting that the cast actually played baseball between takes to loosen up before the big thunderstorm game. The laughter, the real collisions, and the soreness from those matches became the energy that made the sequence so infectious on film. Not everything went smoothly. The contact lenses that gave the Cullens their golden eyes were notoriously uncomfortable, limiting vision and causing frequent irritation. Pattinson often performed scenes half-blind, guided by instinct more than sight. Makeup sessions began before dawn, sometimes lasting over 3 hours, to achieve that marble-like pallor. Kristen Stewart, to contrast, was deliberately kept natural. Minimal makeup, loose hair, uneven texture, because Hardwicke wanted her to feel human in a world of statues. Even small gestures, like the way Bella's hair darkens in rain, while Edward stays ethereal, were intentional layers of visual storytelling. Then there was a fandom, or rather, the awareness of it forming in real time. During production, the Twilight novel series was already a phenomenon, but no one foresaw the frenzy that would follow. Cast and crew members recalled filming in remote towns where teenage fans would appear at dawn, quietly watching from behind barricades. Hardwicke often invited them to observe respectfully, sensing that the story belonged to them as much as it did to the filmmakers. The atmosphere on set wasn't just creative. It was communal, almost sacred in its own way. Everyone involved felt they were building something that mattered to people, even if they didn't yet know why. After the film completion, there were doubts. Studio executives worried it was too slow, too quiet, too female. But the box office explosion that followed silenced those fears and changed the trajectory of young adult cinema. What Twilight achieved behind the scenes was more than commercial. It validated an emotional mode of filmmaking often dismissed as frivolous. Hardwicke had proven that vulnerability could be cinematic power. Years later, revisiting the behind-the-scenes footage feels like glimpsing a time capsule sincerity. You see a group of young actors and filmmakers chasing feeling over perfection, emotion over polish. The cold forest, the awkward pauses, the trembling voices. They weren't calculated. They were lived. That's why Twilight, for all its imperfections, remained so strangely magnetic. It was never about vampires. It was about the courage to feel something deeply. And the team behind the camera lived that truth as fiercely as the characters they brought to life. Every love story carries within it the ghost of a larger question. And in Twilight, that question is ancient. What does it mean to love something that could destroy you? Beneath its teenage facade, the film is an allegory for self-restraint, transformation, and the eternal friction between purity and desire. The supernatural framework is only a surface. What pulses underneath is a story about boundaries, faith, and identity. It's no coincidence that every frame, every whisper, and every lingering gaze feels like a moral equation being tested. The film isn't simply about Bella and Edward falling in love. It's about the existential tension of wanting to become what you love while fearing what that means for your soul. The central theme of Twilight is abstinence as passion. This isn't the puritanical abstinence of old moral tales, but a more psychological one. The kind that gives love its dangerous temperature. Edward's desire for Bella isn't only romantic. It's primal, spiritual, even theological. He loves her precisely because he must not consume her. His entire being becomes a metaphor for oppression, the spark that ignites passion by denying its fulfillment. In this way, Twilight turns self-control into the most erotic gesture imaginable. The restraint, the hesitation, the endless near-touching. It's all foreplay to a moral idea, that the depth of one's feeling is measured not by indulgence, but by what one is willing to suffer to preserve it. Bella, on the other hand, embodies human surrender, not weakness, but a radical willingness to give herself over to the unknown. Her fascination with Edward isn't merely about his beauty or mystery. It's about the transcendence he represents. He is eternal. She is temporary. He is carved in time. She is dissolving in it. Her longing to join him is less a love story and more a rejection of mortality itself. Through her, Twilight explores a theme as old as myth. The human yearning to escape limitation, to touch eternity even if it costs one's humanity. In literary terms, she becomes a modern Eurydice chasing her Orpheus, knowing she may not return unchanged. This push and pull between mortality and immortality structures every symbolic layer of the film. Rain, for instance, isn't just weather, it's baptism. Every drop, every misty forest shot feels like a cleansing ritual, washing away the world Bella came from. The forest itself, dense and endless, stands as a subconscious, the place where the civilized self dissolves into instinct. When Edward confesses his true nature in the woods, it's not just revelation, it's initiation. The forest becomes their church, their cathedral of secrecy. In contrast, Forks High School, with its fluorescent light and chatter, represents the social order of the human world, a world of rules, gossip, and moral smallness. Bella's journey from classroom to canopy mirrors her spiritual migration from reason to transcendence. Light and darkness, of course, dominate the symbolic palette. The entire film is about finding luminosity within shadow. Edward's glittering skin, so often mocked, is perhaps the most overt metaphor in modern cinema for inner divinity trapped in monstrous form. When he reveals it, calling himself a killer, what we actually see is an angel in exile. That contradiction, beauty as burden, is at the heart of the movie's mythology. Edward doesn't fear sunlight because it exposes his monstrosity. He fears it because it exposes his sacredness. Bella's refusal to recoil is her symbolic act of faith, the willingness to love the divine even when it's dangerous. Time itself functions as another theme. Every romantic gesture in Twilight is haunted by temporality. Bella is finite. Edward is not. This disparity gives their love the tension of a clock ticking in the background. Their relationship is built on a countdown. Every embrace feels like an hourglass turning. That's why the pacing of the film is deliberately slow, as if savoring the finite seconds of their coexistence. Even the editing, with its long dissolves and lingering close-ups, mimics the way love distorts time, how 1 second can feel eternal when it's about to end. There's also a deeply spiritual undercurrent running through the story, often overlooked by critics. Edward's self-denial echoes the archetype of the fallen angel, Luciferian beauty, redeemed through love. Bella's attraction to danger mirrors the soul's attraction to divinity. It burns, yet it enlightens. Together, they enact a kind of sacred paradox. Salvation through sin, virtue through temptation. Catherine Hardwicke captures this visually in moments of stillness. The soft glow on Edward's face when he looks at Bella, the slow motion of her hair in the wind. These images border on religious iconography, suggesting that their love, though earthly, brushes against the divine. One of the more subtle symbolic motifs is breath. Bella breathes. Edward doesn't. Their love story, therefore, becomes a meditation on vitality and stillness, the living and the undead, the body and the soul. Every time Edward leans close, we can hear her breath quicken, proof of life, of fragility, of hunger. His calm silence in those moments isn't emptiness, it's reverence. In the scene where he lies beside her while she sleeps, we witness the merging of two existential states: motion and stasis, heat and cold, mortality and immortality. The cinematography treats that juxtaposition as poetry, the living teaching the dead how to feel again. Beyond love, Twilight also engages with the theme of identity through otherness. Edward's existence as a vampire is an allegory for alienation, the experience of feeling fundamentally incompatible with the world. Bella's loneliness mirrors his, suggesting that their connection isn't just romantic, but existential. They are two beings displaced by different forms of eternity, one by too little time, the other by too much. The story's emotional truth lies not in their differences but in their shared isolation. Forks, with its rainy monotony, becomes a geographical manifestation of that loneliness, a liminal place where the ordinary world and the extraordinary one overlap without ever fusing. Even the film's conclusion reinforces its symbolic architecture. The prom scene, often seen as a simple romantic closure, is actually a metaphor for illusion. The lights, the music, the warmth. It's a human dream of stability, briefly borrowed by two people who don't belong in the same timeline. Bella's wish to be turned immortal is less about love and more about liberation. She wants to escape the boundaries of her species, to merge with what she believes is truth. Edward's refusal is mercy disguised as denial. He knows that becoming eternal means losing the very thing that makes love meaningful. Its impermanence. All these symbolic threads weave into a single haunting idea: that love is both a spiritual elevation and a slow erasure self. It purifies and consumes, redeems and corrupts. Twilight's genius lies not in its fantasy, but in its emotional allegory. Every supernatural element, vampires, immortality, forbidden touch, is a metaphor for real human experience. Our hunger for connection, our fear of loss, our battle between desire and discipline. Beneath the glitter, it's a story about souls learning to coexist with their own darkness. And in that sense, Twilight is less about monsters and more about mirrors. Each of us, like Edward and Bella, reflecting back the perilous beauty of wanting something we cannot fully have. The filmmaking craft behind Twilight is one of deliberate imperfection, of stylistic risk and emotional instinct. Catherine Hardwicke wasn't trying to create a polished studio film. She was trying to make something textured, alive, and human. The camera shakes a little, the lighting fluctuates, and the pacing sometimes stutters, and yet all of it works in service of the story's interior rhythm. Every technical choice, from color correction to score composition, is designed to make the viewer feel the tension between stillness and urgency, restraint and release. It's cinema that prioritizes atmosphere over precision, emotion over clarity. That may be why, despite its modest production and critical division, Twilight left a permanent imprint on both popular culture and the business of filmmaking itself. Hardwicke's directing style draws heavily from her background in architecture and art design. She composes scenes like blueprints of emotion, balancing symmetry with fragility. Notice how characters are rarely centered in the frame. Instead, they're placed slightly off-axis, as if they're always on the verge of slipping out of balance. This subtle technique visualizes the instability of first love, the way passion disorients rather than grounds. The camera often tracks through fog and forest in long, patient takes, allowing space for tension to bloom organically. It's a kind of cinematic breathing, and you can sense it in how the story moves. Slowly, like a pulse trying to steady itself. Color grading, perhaps the film's most recognizable technical trait, deserves special mention. The now iconic blue tint wasn't planned as a signature aesthetic. It emerged during post-production as an experiment to unify inconsistent weather conditions during the Oregon shoot. But when Hardwicke saw how the cool tones accentuated both melancholy and mystery, she made it the film's visual identity. The result is that every scene feels like it exists beneath a veil, a subconscious filter between Bella's human warmth and Edward's cold eternity. The palette mirrors emotion, blue for isolation, silver for revelation, gray for longing. When warmth occasionally breaks through, during the meadow scene or the prom sequence, it feels earned, almost sacred. Camera movement in Twilight operates like a diary of sensation. Early scenes use shaky, intimate handheld shots to mirror Bella's uncertainty in Forks. As she grows more entangled with Edward, the cinematography stabilizes, becoming smoother and more fluid, reflecting her surrender to something inevitable. When danger arises, like the arrival of James and his coven, the camera reverts to rapid movement and fragmentation. This contrast between control and chaos reinforces the emotional map of a narrative. Hardwicke and cinematographer Elliot Davis use wide lenses to make the forest feel vast but claustrophobic, ensuring the setting reflected the psychology of the characters. Expansive, yet inescapable. Editing, too, plays a vital emotional role. Nancy Richardson, the film's editor, constructed sequences with rhythmic patience, often holding on reaction shots longer than expected. This slow pace amplifies intimacy and unease. The editing doesn't push the story forward. It lets it unfold like a slow revelation. Notice how scenes often dissolve rather than cut sharply. Time in Twilight doesn't move linearly, it drifts. This gives the film a dreamlike continuity, as if the events exist outside conventional temporality. It's why viewers often describe Twilight as feeling hypnotic, even when little is happening. Sound design was treated as an emotional instrument rather than a technical necessity. Dialogue is intentionally quiet, almost whispered, forcing the audience to lean in, creating intimacy through effort. Ambient noises like rainfall, footsteps, and wind are heightened to near-musical levels, serving as both mood and metaphor. The film's auditory texture mirrors a character's psychological isolation. The louder the environment, the more silent the connection between them becomes. When music enters, it doesn't interrupt. It seeps in like a thought. Carter Burwell's score, particularly Bella's lullaby, bridges this gap between restraint and emotion, a melody that trembles between major and minor, hope and melancholy. On the business side, Twilight's success was nothing short of seismic. With a budget of roughly $37 million, a fraction of most major studio films at the time, it grossed over $407 million worldwide, a figure that stunned even its own producers. It wasn't just financial triumph. It was demographic revelation. Hollywood had underestimated the emotional power of teenage girls and the global appetite for female-led fantasy. The industry learned overnight that female-centric narratives could dominate box offices and shape cultural conversation. What Marvel did for action franchises, Twilight did for romantic fantasy. It built an empire on intimacy. The marketing strategy was revolutionary in its simplicity. Summit Entertainment focused not on the supernatural, but on the relationship. Posters highlighted longing rather than fangs, faces rather than fights. The tagline, "When you can live forever, what do you live for?" framed the film as an existential romance rather than genre fiction. This emotional branding connected directly to young audiences who saw themselves reflected in Bella's vulnerability and Edward's torment. The studio also leveraged emerging social media platforms, MySpace, early YouTube and fan blogs, to create a sense of belonging among viewers before the film even premiered. It wasn't just a movie release. It was a cultural initiation. The cinematography's technical imperfections, once mocked, became part of its authenticity. The unpolished visual style gave the film an indie sensibility rare in blockbuster culture. It felt personal, almost like someone's memory caught on camera. This intimacy became a blueprint for later adaptations of young adult novels, from The Hunger Games to The Fault in Our Stars. In retrospect, Twilight introduced a new cinematic language for adolescent yearning, one that fused the mythic with the mundane, the epic with the internal. Critical reception was, at the time, sharply divided. Some reviewers dismissed the dialogue and pacing as overwrought, but audiences didn't care. What critics read as melodrama, fans recognized as sincerity. It was proof that emotion, when delivered without irony, could bypass intellectual critique and reach something primal in viewers. That emotional resonance translated into box office gold. The film opened to $69.6 million in its first weekend in the U.S., a record for a female-directed film at the time. It also marked the first major Hollywood franchise helmed by a woman, though Hardwicke's departure after the first installment underscored the industry's reluctance to sustain female creative leadership despite proven success. From a filmmaking standpoint, Twilight stands as a paradoxical triumph. Technically flawed, yet emotionally exact. It created a cinematic grammar of intimacy that countless others tried to replicate, but never fully captured. Its visual motifs, mist, hands nearly touching, faces half lit in shadow, became iconic shorthand for romantic yearning in the 2000s. In the years since, many have revisited it not as a guilty pleasure, but as a cultural artifact of sincerity. In the end, Twilight's technical legacy isn't about innovation or spectacle. It's about courage. The courage to be still, to be quiet, to be unabashedly earnest in a cinematic landscape addicted to irony. It proved that you don't need grand scale to evoke grandeur. You only need light that trembles like love and silence that aches like memory. And perhaps that's why, long after its box office records faded, its images still linger, not as perfection, but as proof that sometimes the most haunting cinema is the kind that dares to feel everything, flaws and all. When Twilight was released in 2008, few expected its cast, then largely unknown, to become the faces of a global phenomenon that would redefine pop culture for a generation. What happened instead was lightning in a bottle. Performances that were awkward, raw, and strangely magnetic came together to create an emotional honesty Hollywood rarely allows. Behind every line, every nervous breath, and every longing look was a group of young actors grappling with the enormity of a story that felt bigger than themselves. What makes revisiting their performances so moving now is how unguarded they are, each of them, in their own way, reflecting the fragile sincerity of the film's tone. Kristen Stewart, only 18 at the time, approached Bella Swan with a kind of quiet ferocity. In early interviews, she spoke of wanting Bella to feel internal but never passive, someone whose stillness had a constant storm of thought. Critics often mistook her hesitancy for stiffness, but that was deliberate. Stewart understood that Bella's awkwardness was her realism. She wasn't a cinematic heroine shaped for fantasy. She was an ordinary girl confronting something mythic. In press interviews, Stewart described the experience as being in a perpetual state of sensory overload. That vulnerability, that inability to contain emotion, became the heart of her performance. Watching her now, you realize she wasn't acting in the traditional sense. She was reacting, existing, absorbing the atmosphere around her like someone half dreaming. Robert Pattinson's Edward Cullen became an instant cultural archetype. though the man behind the role seemed deeply skeptical of his own fame. In interviews, he often half-joked about his discomfort with the character's idolization, once calling Edward the most ridiculous person imaginable. And yet, what he brought to the screen was haunting restraint. His interpretation turned supernatural romance into existential despair. The way he delivered lines like, "You don't know how long I've waited for you," carried the weight of centuries. Pattinson was methodical but intuitive, finding truth in silence rather than speech. Hardwicke encouraged that approach, often asking him to just feel the scene and stop performing. The result was a performance that transcended its teenage heartthrob packaging. Edward became a metaphor for the burden of self-control, and Pattinson's discomfort with fame mirrored his character's discomfort with love. The chemistry between Stewart and Pattinson, so palpable on screen, became one of Hollywood's most discussed relationships off-screen. Neither actor courted publicity, yet their quiet bond became a tabloid obsession. Both later admitted that the real-life connection helped them navigate the vulnerability of their roles, because both, like their characters, were learning to exist under scrutiny. There's a moment in the first film, Bella and Edward sitting in the cafeteria, wordless, just watching each other, where the line between fiction and truth blurs. You sense that what you're seeing isn't just acting. It's two young people navigating genuine, fragile fascination. That authenticity can't be manufactured. It's one of the reasons Twilight endures as more than pop spectacle. Among the supporting cast, each performer added a crucial texture to the film's emotional ecosystem. Billy Burke, as Charlie Swan, grounded the story in realism with his weary affection and awkward fatherly silence. His small, half-spoken lines, "I like the guy," gave the film humor and humanity amidst its ethereal tone. Ashley Greene's Alice, ethereal and intuitive, became the film's emotional bridge between mortal and immortal worlds. Peter Facinelli's Carlyle brought moral gravity. His presence felt like a hymn in human form. Nikki Reed's Rosalie introduced the film's undercurrent of resentment, reminding audiences that immortality doesn't erase envy. And Taylor Lautner, though his role was small in the first installment, brought a kind of open, sunlit warmth that contrasted beautifully with Edward's marble stillness, foreshadowing the triangle that would define the saga's later installments. Interviews from the cast during promotion reveal how unaware they were of what they were creating. Most thought they were making a niche indie film with a loyal but modest fan base. When the movie premiered and thousands of screaming fans filled city blocks, Pattinson reportedly turned to Stewart and whispered, "What just happened?" That astonishment defined the early Twilight press tours, actors bewildered by hysteria, unsure how to reconcile their small, introspective movie with the tidal wave of cultural obsession it had unleashed. Critical reviews at the time were mixed, but audience reactions bordered on spiritual. Teenagers treated it not as entertainment, but as initiation. Screenings became collective experiences of emotional catharsis, audiences gasping, sighing, sometimes crying in sync. For many young viewers, Twilight wasn't escapism. It was recognition, the vulnerability, the awkward silences, the feeling of being seen and unseen at once. It mirrored the emotional turbulence of adolescence better than most high-budget coming-of-age dramas ever could. Critics missed that nuance, but audiences didn't. Rotten Tomatoes may have given a divided score, but fan blogs, early Tumblr pages, and YouTube montages turned Twilight into a living language of longing. Memes were born, yes, but so were essays, fan fiction, and video tributes dissecting every line and glance. There was humor, of course, endless jokes about sparkling vampires. But beneath the irony, genuine affection persisted. As the years passed, even critics who once dismissed it began to reconsider its sincerity. In 2018, on its 10th anniversary, Twilight began to be reevaluated as a cult classic, a film that dared be emotionally vulnerable in an era obsessed with detachment. Interviews years later show the cast looking back with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. Pattinson has admitted that he's grown to appreciate how deeply people connected with the story, calling it the strangest, most sincere thing I've ever done. Stewart, now one of cinema's most acclaimed actresses, often offends the film's heart. It was never meant to be cool. It was meant to feel like falling in love and falling apart. That retrospective honesty makes the Twilight phenomenon even more poignant. It wasn't just a career launch pad. It was a crucible for an entire generation of actors learning to bear emotional truth under impossible expectations. Audience retrospectives are equally fascinating. Those who were teenagers when the film released now revisit as adults, finding new meaning in what once felt melodramatic. The once mock blue tint now feels nostalgic. The silences now feel sacred. Many describe it as comfort cinema, not because it's light or easy, but because it captures a moment in time when sincerity was still allowed to exist without irony. In online forums, people confess that the movie feels like a memory rather than a film, something they once lived through rather than watched. What the cast and audience ultimately share is a sense of Twilight as experience rather than performance. It isn't perfect. It was never meant to be, but it is honest. Every trembling word, every uncertain glance, every pause heavy with fear and desire, all came from a group of young artists trying to express something fragile and real. And in doing so, they didn't just create a film. They created a cultural echo, one that continues to shimmer quietly and stubbornly, like Edward's skin in sunlight, impossible, beautiful, and strangely eternal. My literature-loving friends, as I sit here reflecting on Twilight, I realize that its lasting power was never about the vampires, nor even the romance. It was about a feeling, that fragile, trembling feeling of being young and caught between danger and devotion. Watching it now, years later, I can still sense that pulse beneath its silvery surface. The slow heartbeat of first love, the hush before confession, the ache of wanting to stay in a moment that can't last. So many dismissed it as teenage melodrama, but that was always its secret strength. It dared to take young emotions seriously, to treat longing as a language worth speaking. Beneath the supernatural veneer, it's really a love story between impermanence and eternity, and that's why it continues to haunt us long after its glitter fades. When Bella steps into Edward's world, she's not just entering a realm of fantasy. She's crossing into the universal human desire to transcend. That's the true soul of Twilight. Its fascination with transformation, with the idea that love might be the one force strong enough to defy mortality. But the film is honest enough to show the cost of that wish. Every moment of beauty is shadowed by the threat of loss. Every tender gesture hides a tremor of restraint. That contradiction, love is both salvation and peril, is what gives a story its mythic dimension. Even when the dialogue stumbles or the pacing lingers, there's a sincerity in its stillness that feels almost holy. It believes, unapologetically, in the sacredness of feeling too much. And that, I think, is what so many people misunderstood. Twilight was never meant to be ironic or clever or detached. It was meant to be earnest, a cinematic diary of yearning. It captures the liminal space between adolescence and adulthood, where every touch feels forbidden and every silence feels infinite. For a generation of viewers, it was the first time they saw their inner turmoil mirrored on screen, without judgment. Bella's quiet defiance, Edward's impossible morality, the constant rain, all of it formed a collective mood that many didn't have words for at the time. The movie gave that ache a shape, a color, a sound. It turned emotional vulnerability into atmosphere. From a storytelling perspective, Twilight closes not with resolution, but with suspension. That final dance beneath the fairy lights, Bella asking for immortality and Edward refusing, is an ending that denies satisfaction but delivers truth. Love doesn't always complete. Sometimes it endures unfinished, and that incompleteness is its beauty. The film's closing shot, Victoria watching from the balcony, the future already unraveling, reminds us that peace is fleeting, that every dream carries its own shadow. Yet, even in that uncertainty, there's something deeply romantic. The promise of love remains, hovering like mist over the Pacific forest. As years passed and sequels expanded the universe, nothing ever quite replicated the alchemy of this first installment. Hardwicke's Twilight stands apart because it feels handcrafted, an intimate, trembling confession rather than a corporate product. Its imperfections are its fingerprints, its sincerity, its heartbeat. It's a film that refuses to explain itself. It simply feels. And perhaps that's why it lingers, like a memory that's half dream, half ache. It sits somewhere in the collective consciousness of those who once believed that love could be eternal if only we dared enough to suffer for it. Looking back now, I see Twilight not just as cinema, but as an emotional artifact, a document of sincerity in an era of irony. It's easy to laugh at its excesses, but harder to dismiss its truth. Every generation deserves one story that teaches them how to yearn without apology, and this one belonged to the late 2000s. Its success reshaped Hollywood's understanding of female audiences, but its deeper gift was quieter. It gave millions of people permission to feel deeply, even foolishly, and to call that depth beautiful. So as the credits roll in my mind once more, the piano notes of Bella's lullaby fading into rain, I find myself grateful for what this film dared to be: a whisper in an age of noise, a confession in a culture that prefers irony, a love story that believed, without shame, in the transformative power of feeling. And perhaps that's why it endures, not because it was flawless, but because it was honest. If you, my friends, ever find yourself revisiting Twilight, don't watch it as a guilty pleasure. Watch it as a memory of who you were when love first scared you, when longing first felt sacred, when restraint was the proof of feeling. Let it remind you that even the most improbable stories can touch something true. And if this reflection stirred something in you, some echo of that forgotten ache, then perhaps you'll stay with me a little longer on this journey through cinema and meaning. If you enjoyed this reflection, please like, subscribe, and share Cinema Vault with your friends who still believe that movies like love